Cold has a way of becoming permanent memory. The kind that makes your breath visible in the recycled air of an underhive hab block, where the heating systems failed 3 generations before I was born, and no one had the resources to repair them. 41 degrees Celsius during the day cycle when the manufacturer vents pumped waste heat through the district. 28 degrees at night. I was 11 years old when they came for me, my hands wrapped around a cup of recaf substitute, not for the taste, which was like licking rust, but for the warmth of the tin cup against my palms. My name was Jeren Vastik. I had a sister named Mara who coughed blood every morning, and a mother who worked sorting salvage in the lower processing zones. These things exist in my memory with the clarity of data that has been archived and protected, because I knew even then that I would need to preserve them. The chaplain who selected me told me I was blessed. He was enormous. A figure in midnight blue armor, with the crescent moon of our chapter emblazoned across his pauldron. He spoke the words of the Emperor's benediction while scanning my genetic markers with a device that hummed at a frequency I could feel in my teeth. "You carry the gene seed of Sanguinius," he said. "You will become one of the blood." I did not know then what that meant. Not truly. The Blood Angels were legend in the hive, angels who descended from the sky to purge Xenos and heretic alike. I knew the stories, I knew the glory. What I did not know, what they did not tell the children they selected from the underhive populations across 1,000 worlds, was the other name our chapter carried. The name whispered in the upper spires and recorded in sealed inquisitorial files. Flesh Eaters. They took me that day. My mother made the sign of the Aquila and wept. Mara coughed blood into her hand and watched me leave with eyes that understood I was already dead to her, that the person who might return, if any person returned at all, would not be her brother. She was correct. The transport that carried me away from that hab block lifted off at 1400 hours local time. Through the viewport, the only home I had ever known receded into the polluted haze of the hive's lower levels. My mother's face, I tried to memorize every line, every detail. The file is still intact. I access it sometimes when the hunger becomes difficult to process. The fortress monastery hung in orbit above a death world whose name I never learned. They did not waste time on names for the uninitiated. We were numbers. I was designate 773. There were 142 of us in that intake. The apothecarian processed us in shifts, taking blood samples, bone marrow, tissue biopsies. They were searching for compatibility markers, for the genetic foundations that might survive what came next. 41 of us survived the first round of implantation, the progenoid glands, the os modula, the biscopia. They cut us open and inserted the gene seed organs while we were conscious. Strapped to surgical tables in a chamber that smelled of antiseptic, and something underneath it, something organic and wrong, that the antiseptic couldn't quite mask. The apothecaries worked in silence except for the litanies they murmured over each implantation, prayers to the Emperor and the Primarch whose genetic legacy we were inheriting. "Through his blood, we are transformed," they chanted. "Through his flesh, we are made whole." Later, I learned these were not standard codex litanies. They were specific to our chapter. They were warnings disguised as blessings. The pain was comprehensive, not sharp, not burning. Those adjectives are insufficient. It was a rewriting of every nerve ending, a systematic dismantling of what human biology considered tolerable. My own screaming became something I observed from a distance. The moment my voice gave out, I continued screaming anyway, the sound reduced to a wet rasp that the apothecaries ignored. They had heard it before. They would hear it again from the next batch of aspirants. This was the process. This was necessary. Survival came because my body accepted the foreign organs. 22 others did not share this fortune. Over the course of 6 weeks, they died while I watched. Some rejected the implants, and their bodies tore themselves apart from the inside. Others survived the initial implantation but fell to infection or organ failure as their systems tried to adapt to the changes. The dead were removed during the night cycle. By morning, the surgical tables were clean and ready for the next procedure. During recovery periods, they fed us. Nutrient paste dispensed from automated systems, calculated to provide exactly what our transforming bodies required. It tasted like nothing. It was white. Consuming it became a mechanical act, fuel intake logged and processed. But even then, even in those early weeks, something else stirred underneath. The hunger the paste satisfied was not complete. Another hunger lived beneath it. A hunger that had no name yet. A hunger that watched the apothecaries work on the aspirants who didn't survive and wondered, briefly, about the flesh they were wasting. The thought was suppressed immediately. At 11 years old, becoming something that was not human, I did not yet understand that the hunger was not mine alone. It was inherited. It was in the blood. His name was Kelvin, aspirant 449. He had been selected from a hive world in the Segmentum Obscurus, a place where the sun never reached the ground and the population lived in perpetual twilight. Scars crossed his hands from factorum work, thin white lines that stood out against skin already beginning to thicken and pale, as the os medulla restructured his skeleton. We did not speak during the early months. Speech was unnecessary. We were all enduring the same process, but he caught my attention. He had a habit of counting under his breath during the surgical procedures. Not prayers, numbers, sequential, methodical. 1, 2, 3, 4. As if by counting the seconds he could contain the pain within measured intervals, as if numbers could make it tolerable. Counting with him began silently, in my own mind. It helped. Not much, but enough. 12 additional implantation surgeries processed us over the next 38 months. The catalepsian node, the hemastomen, the Laramann's organ. With each implantation, we became less like what we had been, and more like what the chapter required us to be. Our bodies grew, bones lengthened and thickened, muscle mass increased beyond human parameters. Our hearts were replaced with larger, more efficient organs. A second heart was added. Our blood changed composition, carrying oxygen more efficiently, clotting faster, responding to combat stimuli with chemical precision. And the hunger grew. The implantation of the omophagia marked the moment when understanding crystallized. The omophagia, the organ that allows a space marine to gain information by consuming genetic material from the dead. Standard Codex Doctrine. A tactical advantage. The apothecary who installed mine, a veteran whose face was hidden behind a rebreather and whose hands moved with mechanical precision, recited the usual litanies. But after the procedure, after being returned to the recovery chamber and left alone with the pain and the changes, the sensation emerged unmistakable. The hunger had focus now. It had direction. It was not seeking nutrient paste. It was seeking something specific, something warm, something that had recently stopped living. This was reported to the chaplain during our next indoctrination session. We knelt in rows before him, 19 aspirants remaining from the original 142. The chaplain stood above us in his full armor, a figure of absolute authority, his skull-faced helmet reflecting the candlelight from the chamber's devotional alcoves. "The hunger you feel is sacred," he told us. His voice resonated through the vox speakers in his helmet, making it seem like the words came from everywhere at once. "It is the legacy of our Primarch. Sanguinius, the great angel, blessed us with his blood. But that blessing carries a burden. The red thirst, the rage, the need." He paced before us, each footfall of his ceramite boots echoing in the stone chamber. "We are flesh-eaters. We do not hide from what we are. We do not deny the hunger, but we control it. We feed it only as necessity demands, and we do so in service to the Emperor. This is the discipline that separates us from the fallen. This is the line we walk." Processing his words revealed the doctrine he was teaching, but even then, the rationalization embedded in his speech became apparent. Necessity was a flexible concept. Service to the Emperor could justify many things. Kelvin raised his head. From the corner of my eye, I saw him. His jaw was clenched, the muscle working beneath skin that had begun to show the pallor common to our chapter. He did not speak. The chaplain did not call on him. But in that moment, recognition passed between us. Kelvin had heard the same rationalization. We looked at each other briefly. Neither of us said anything. The transformation continued. By 14 standard years old, resembling anything that could pass for human became impossible. Height, 2.5 meters, bones laced with ceramic compounds that made them nearly unbreakable. Muscles dense enough to crush steel. Reaction time enhanced to superhuman levels by the implanted organs and the chemical conditioning we underwent daily. Survival in vacuum for limited periods, consumption of toxic materials and neutralization through specialized organ functions, weeks without sleep, and hunger, constantly, endlessly hungry. The chapter fed us, not just nutrient paste anymore. They fed us what we needed. Criminals, mostly, the death world below the fortress monastery had a population, small, scattered settlements that survived through subsistence farming and hunting the local megafauna. Crime still existed there. Murder, rape, treason against the Imperium. The local enforcers would hold the condemned until a chapter serf arrived to collect them. The feeding chambers in the lower levels of the fortress monastery received them. The crimes the condemned had committed were never disclosed. That information was irrelevant. What mattered was that they had been judged, sentenced, and we required flesh. 15 years old, my transformation nearly complete. Only the black carapace remained to be implanted. The first condemned man they brought was maybe 30 standard years. Tattoos covered his arms in the local dialect, prayers to the emperor. He was sobbing. The serf who delivered him chained him to a ring set into the chamber floor and left without speaking. Standing in training robes, looking down at the man, he looked up. He saw what I was becoming. The tears stopped. Something in his eyes went flat. Understanding dawned that prayer would not help him, that mercy was not available, that what happened next was inevitable. Please, he said anyway. The hunger responded to his fear. The omophagia registered his terror as chemical signals, adrenaline, cortisol, pheromones of prey in the presence of a predator. My body reacted. Salivation increased, heart rate elevated. My hands flexed involuntarily. Training had prepared for this. The chaplains had been explicit. Do not hesitate, they had instructed. Hesitation is doubt. Doubt is weakness. The condemned are fuel, necessary fuel. Consume them and gain strength for the emperor's work. Kneeling beside the man, he tried to scramble away, but the chains held him. One hand on his shoulder, my hand covered most of his upper torso. He felt small, fragile, breakable. Your death serves the Imperium, the ritual phrase emerged, the benediction we had been taught. Then feeding occurred. The act itself will not be described in detail. It is archived. It is data carried forward. What matters, the hunger was satisfied. Temporarily, the genetic material consumed was processed through the omophagia. Flashes of the man's memories arrived, fragments of a life in the settlements, a woman's face, the interior of a hab structure lit by firelight, the weight of Alaskan in his hands. Information surfaced that he had killed an enforcer during a raid on a grain storehouse, that he had a daughter who would grow up without him. That I did not care. The hunger was satisfied. That was what mattered. Clarity emerged afterward. Strength, focus. The constant gnawing need that had been building for months was gone. Thinking became possible without the distraction of appetite. Cleaning occurred in the chamber's wash basin. The water ran red, then clear. My reflection in the polished steel mirror showed the changes. My face had hardened, sharpened. My eyes had developed the slight redness common to our chapter, the first sign of the red thirst's permanent presence in our biology. The reflection showed what I was. Aspirant 773, soon to be a battle brother of the Flesh Eaters chapter. A weapon in the Emperor's service. A controlled predator bound by oaths and doctrine, and the thin fiction that what we did was necessary rather than what we wanted. Kelvin completed his first feeding the same week. We did not discuss it. There was nothing to discuss. We had both crossed the line. We had both become what the chapter required. But the change in him afterward was visible. The way he held himself. The way he moved with a new certainty, a confidence that came from having fed the hunger and survived the guilt. Ordination as full battle brothers came 6 months later, after the final implantation of the black carapace. The ceremony took place in the chapter's reclusium, before an altar decorated with the bones of our predecessors and the holy texts of the Codex Astartes. The chapter master himself presided, a veteran of 4 centuries who had fought in campaigns whose names were legend. He anointed us with sacred oils and spoke the oaths that would bind us to the chapter until death. "You are no longer what you were," he intoned. "You are the Emperor's angels. You are death incarnate. You are flesh-eaters, and you will bring his wrath to all who stand against him." We knelt and swore. The words were spoken and meant. Belief existed then that we were righteous, that the hunger was a trial borne with honor. That feeding on the condemned was justice rendered in the most efficient form. A name was given again, Brother Vastic. The number was archived. Armor arrived, Mark 7 plate painted in the chapter's colors, dark red trimmed with bone white. A bolter, combat knife, grenades. Assignment to the 3rd Company, 8th Tactical Squad. Kelvin was assigned to the same squad. Deployment together came 3 weeks later, boarding a strike cruiser bound for a war zone in the Segmentum Tempestus. The war was against orcs. Had spilled across 7 systems, overwhelming the local Astra Militarum forces and threatening to establish a permanent presence in the sector. Our chapter deployed 3 companies to break the greenskin momentum. Planetfall on a world called Ghast's Landing, where the orcs had fortified a mining complex and were using it as a staging ground for further expansion. The battle lasted 6 days. The orcs came at us in waves, screaming and firing their crude weapons with wild enthusiasm. We cut them down with precise bolter fire and controlled charges. 83 orcs killed that were logged personally. The number was likely higher. In the chaos of melee combat, tracking individual kills becomes difficult. The orcs bled green. They smelled like fungus and machine oil. When they died, they fell like biological machinery shutting down. No fear, no hesitation, just the cessation of function. They did not satisfy the hunger. The Omophagia rejected their genetic material as incompatible. Xeno's flesh provided no nourishment, no tactical information, no relief. By the 4th day of combat, the hunger had returned. All of us felt it. The 3rd Company's chaplain, Brother Moloch, a veteran who had served for 2 centuries, knew the signs. On the 5th day, he authorized a feeding. Not from the orcs, from the human population caught in the war zone. Ghast's Landing had been an imperial mining world with a population of 40 million. The orcs had killed approximately half during their invasion. The survivors had fled to refugee camps or hidden in the ruins. Some had collaborated with the orcs, desperate acts of survival that were technically treason. The planetary governors and forces had compiled a list. 370, 2 individuals marked for execution once the war was over. We collected them early. Chaplain Moloch authorized it. The war demands strength, he said. The Emperor demands victory. Feed. The 3rd Company descended on the refugee camps at night. We took the condemned quietly, efficiently. They screamed. Some fought. It made no difference. We were Space Marines. The disparity was absolute. 4 individuals were consumed that night. 3 men, 1 woman. The woman had traded information to the orcs about Imperial troop movements in exchange for food. The men had participated in looting Imperial supply depots. All of them had been sentenced to death by the enforcers. All of them provided the genetic material required. Processing their memories occurred automatically. Flashes of fear, desperation, hunger. The woman had children. 2 daughters under the age of 10. She had traded information to feed them. The enforcers had executed the daughters anyway. To prevent the spread of traitorous bloodlines, this information was archived and the mission continued. The hunger was satisfied. That was what mattered. Kelvin fed beside me, watching him consume a man who had been caught stealing from a Munitorum warehouse. Kelvin worked methodically, efficiently. When he finished, he looked at me. His face was spattered with blood. His eyes were clear. "Necessary," he said. Not a question, a statement. A reminder to himself as much as to me. Necessary. Agreement came. We cleaned ourselves and returned to the front lines. The war concluded 36 hours later when we breached the Orc warlord's command bunker and eliminated him and his inner circle. The WH40K collapsed without leadership. The surviving Orcs scattered into the wilderness where they would be hunted down by local forces over the following months. Return to the fortress monastery came as victors. The campaign was logged as a success. Minimal casualties suffered, 6 battle brothers killed, 19 wounded. The Orc forces had been broken. The sector was secure. No one mentioned the condemned we had consumed. It was not part of the official record. It was simply what had happened. What always happened. What would continue to happen every time the hunger grew too strong to ignore. Age, 16 years old. Hundreds killed. Fed on the guilty. Belief in righteousness remained. This belief persisted for 9 more years. The pattern repeated. Deployment, combat, victory, feeding. The Third Company fought across a dozen systems, purging heretics on shrine worlds where the population had fallen to chaos worship, battling tyrannid vanguard organisms on the eastern fringe, boarding a space hulk infested with gen-stealers, and cleansing it section by section over the course of 8 weeks. Between deployments, return to the fortress monastery occurred. Training, equipment maintenance, attendance at the chaplain's sermons, and feeding. The chapter maintained the arrangement with the local enforcers. Criminals were delivered to us. Murderers, rapists, those who had committed treason or heresy. The condemned arrived in chains and left as archived genetic data inside our Omophageia organs. It was efficient. It was logical. It served dual purpose. Justice was rendered, and the chapter's needs were met. No questions were raised. None of us questioned openly. But details accumulated, small observations building over time like sediment into stone. The definition of criminal became flexible. Early in service, feeding occurred only on those who had committed capital crimes. Clear violations, documented cases. But as years passed, the crimes became less severe. A man who had spoken out against the planetary governor's tithes. A woman who had been caught with prohibited literature. A youth who had failed to report for labor conscription. All of them were condemned. All of them were delivered to us. All of them fed the hunger. The chaplains never questioned the enforcers' judgments. Acceptance of the condemned as guilty occurred because we required them to be guilty. Their guilt justified our appetite. If they were not guilty, then what we did was murder. If what we did was murder, then we were not righteous. The logic was circular and necessary. Kelvin had stopped counting. He used to count during combat, during pain, during difficult moments. A coping mechanism, a way to measure and contain. But sometime during our 5th year of service, he stopped. The question was asked once, during a long watch on board a strike cruiser between deployments. "No point," he said. We were alone in the armory, performing maintenance on our bolters. His hands moved across his weapon with practiced precision, checking the firing mechanism, blessing the barrel with sacred oils. I was counting to make it finite, to put boundaries on it. But there are no boundaries. It doesn't end, so why count? His words were processed. Understanding came. The transformation had been presented as a journey with a destination. Aspirant to battle brother, mortal to angel. But the truth was different. The transformation never stopped. Every feeding changed us slightly. Every act of consumption pushed us further from what we had been. We were asymptotic. approaching something we would never quite reach, but getting closer with every step. "Do you regret it?" the question emerged. Kelvin looked at me. His face was calm. His eyes carried the permanent red tinge of the thirst. Would it matter if I did? It would not. We had both sworn oaths. We were both bound to the chapter until death. Regret was irrelevant data. We were weapons. Weapons do not regret their function. Maintenance was completed, and we reported for the next mission briefing. The shift began during a campaign on a world called Meridian Secundus. It was a hive world, population 80 billion, standard imperial compliance. The hive's upper nobility had fallen under the influence of a Slaneshi cult. By the time the Inquisition identified the corruption, the cult had spread through 3 of the 7 major hive spires. The Ordo Hereticus called for exterminatus. The sector command refused. The planet's manufacturers produced weapons and ammunition for 17 nearby systems. Total annihilation would cripple the sector's defensive capabilities. The compromise was surgical purging. 3 Space Marine chapters were deployed, us, the Raven Guard, and a company of Marines errant. We would cleanse the corrupted spires while preserving the functional population. Standard operation. Planetfall occurred and the purge began. The cultists had fortified their positions in the spire tops, where the nobility lived in obscene wealth, fighting upward through hab levels filled with civilians who had not yet been corrupted, but who would not, or could not, flee. The fighting was close quarters, bolter fire in enclosed spaces, the scream of chain weapons, the smell of burning promethium and cooked flesh. The cultists died screaming prayers to the Dark Prince. Their bodies were twisted by the corruption they had embraced. Extra limbs, compound eyes, flesh that moved with involuntary mutations. We burned them. No mercy was shown because mercy would have been wasted. But the operation took time, weeks. The fighting was intense and constant. The hunger grew. No condemned criminals were available. The local enforcers had been compromised or killed. The Inquisition's focus was on purging the cult, not managing our chapter's specific needs. Chaplain Moloch made the decision on the 17th day of the campaign. Gathering in a command post we had secured on the 75th level of Spire Primus. 37 battle brothers of the 3rd Company, all showing the strain of extended combat without proper feeding. "The population below is tainted," Moloch announced. His armor was scarred from weeks of combat. His skull-faced helmet regarded us with empty eye sockets. "They lived in proximity to corruption. They may carry spiritual contamination. We are authorized to cull those deemed compromised." He transmitted a list to our tactical displays. 2,314 names. Civilians from the mid-levels of the spire. No specific crimes listed. Just proximity. Potential compromise. Suspicion. "This is within operational parameters," Moloch continued. "The Inquisition has granted purge authorization for this spire. We are simply expanding the scope of that authorization to address strategic necessity." Strategic necessity. Processing the phrase revealed its meaning. Feeding was going to occur on people who had not been judged. Not officially. Not by any legitimate authority. Justification was being created in real time, stretching the definition of compromised to cover our appetite. Looking at Kelvin, he stood 3 meters to my left, his posture rigid in his armor. His helmet was mag-locked to his belt. His face was expressionless, but his jaw muscle worked. Once, twice. No one objected. We were flesh-eaters. We were hungry. Chaplain Moloch had provided justification that was sufficient. Deployment to the mid-levels occurred that night, taking people from their hab blocks quietly. Most did not resist. They had lived under the shadow of the cult for months. They were broken, terrified, willing to believe that the Space Marines were there to help them. 2,314 Imperial citizens were consumed over the course of 4 days. Some of them may have been spiritually compromised. Some of them may have been genuinely tainted by proximity to chaos. Most of them were simply unlucky. They lived in the wrong section of the spire at the wrong time, and a Space Marine chapter needed to feed. 16 individuals were personally consumed. Men, women, elderly, young. The Omophagia does not discriminate. Genetic material is genetic material. Processing their memories occurred. A woman who worked in a textile factory. A man who had been an administratum clerk. A youth who had dreamed of joining the Astra Militarum. None of them were cultists. None of them had done anything worthy of death. But they fed the hunger, and the hunger was all that mattered. On the 4th night, after the feeding was complete, Kelvin was found in a deserted corridor on the 63rd level. He sat against a wall, his armor still marked with blood he had not yet cleaned. His bolter lay across his lap. He stared at nothing. Sitting down beside him, neither of us spoke for a long time. The hive around us hummed with the distant sounds of combat, of manufactorums continuing their work, of billions of humans living and dying without ever knowing how close they were to annihilation. "We crossed a line," Kelvin finally said. His voice was quiet, flat. "We've been crossing it for years. But this one was different. Disagreement was impossible. The truth was self-evident. Moloch said it was necessary. The words offered, not a defense, just a statement of fact. Moloch says a lot of things. Kelvin turned his head to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot. The red of the thirst seemed darker than usual. We tell ourselves we're different from the renegade chapters. We tell ourselves we control the hunger. But what we did here, how is this control? We fed on innocence because it was convenient, because the alternative was admitting we couldn't finish the mission without breaking our oaths. What would you have had us do? The question emerged. I don't know. He looked back at the empty corridor. But I know what we did, and I know I helped do it. I consumed 11 people who had committed no crime. I gained their memories. I know their names. I know what their lives were. And I did it anyway because I was hungry, and because Moloch gave me permission. He stood up, the servos in his armor whining softly. We're not loyalists anymore, Vastic. We're just pretending. We're renegades who haven't admitted it yet. And the worst part is that I don't think I care. The hunger doesn't care about loyalty. It cares about being fed. He walked away, sitting in the corridor for another hour, processing his words, checking them against archived data, reviewing the memories consumed, examining personal reactions, searching for regret, for guilt, for some evidence of being still the person who had been selected from that underhive hab block. Nothing was found. Just hunger. Just the quiet satisfaction of appetite met. Just the cold logic that we had done what was necessary to complete the mission. Kelvin was right. We had crossed the line. We were crossing it every day. And continuation would occur because the alternative was to stop being flesh-eaters, and we no longer knew how to be anything else. The campaign on Meridian Secundus concluded 3 weeks later. Purging the cultists, cleansing the spires, leaving the hive world scarred but functional. The Inquisition classified the operation as a success. The sector command expressed gratitude. No one mentioned the 2,314 civilians who had disappeared during the fighting. Return to the fortress monastery occurred. New orders arrived. Deployment again. The cycle continued, and silence was maintained. No report filed. No objection raised with the chaplains or the chapter master. Complicity through silence. Loyalty to the chapter, and through that loyalty, treason to the Imperium we claim to serve. This is the testimony carried forward. This is the data archived. Brother Vastic of the Flesh Eaters chapter, knowing exactly what he is. The years accumulated. Precision tracking ceased after the 50th year of service. Time became measured differently. Not in standard years, but in campaigns, in deployments, in the intervals between feedings. The catalepsia node allowed extended periods without sleep, and this capability was used frequently. Sleep brought dreams. Dreams brought the faces of the consumed. Consciousness was preferable. focused on immediate tactical requirements rather than processing archive data that served no operational purpose. Kelvan and I served together for 73 years, fighting on 147 worlds, killing enemies of the Imperium in numbers that became meaningless. Thousands, tens of thousands, eventually losing count entirely. Decorated 12 times. Commendations received from chapter masters, from inquisitors, from lord commanders of entire sectors. We were exemplary flesh-eaters, feeding the hunger and delivering the Emperor's wrath with equal efficiency. But between us, in the moments when we were alone, we both knew the truth. We were falling, slowly, incrementally. Each feeding pushed us further from the loyalist ideal we had sworn to uphold. The chapter was falling with us. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of damnation, no great betrayal that marked us as renegades. It was erosion. It was compromise. It was the steady accumulation of small transgressions that became policy, that became doctrine, that became what we were. The list of acceptable feeding sources expanded. First condemned criminals, then suspected criminals, then civilians in corrupted zones, then refugees who might have been exposed to Xeno's influence, then Imperial Guard regiments who had suffered heavy casualties and whose survivors were deemed psychologically compromised by the horrors they had witnessed. Each expansion was justified. Each had reasoning behind it. The chaplains provided theological framework. The librarians consulted the Emperor's tarot and found ambiguous omens that could be interpreted as permission. The chapter master authorized each new protocol with the grave solemnity of someone making difficult but necessary decisions. And we fed. We always fed. Brothers were watched losing control. Brother Kazran, who had served for 120 years, went feral during a campaign against Dark Eldar raiders. He broke from formation during combat and fell upon wounded Imperial Guard soldiers, consuming them while they screamed for the Emperor's mercy. 6 of us restrained him. The chaplains executed him on the field. His gene seed was not recovered. His name was struck from the chapter records. Brother Van lasted longer. 215 years of service before the red thirst consumed his sanity entirely. He began feeding without authorization, taking victims from the fortress monastery's serf population. 11 serfs consumed before discovery. The chapter master ordered him chained in the reclusium and subjected to purification rituals. The rituals lasted 3 months. Van died howling prayers to a god who did not answer. These incidents were catalogued, the pattern observed. The longer we served, the harder control became to maintain. The hunger was not static. It grew. It evolved. It learned. With each feeding, satisfaction lasted for shorter periods. The intervals between necessary consumption decreased. What had once been a quarterly requirement became monthly, then weekly, then constant background need that was never fully satisfied no matter how much we consumed. We were becoming the thing we had been warned against, becoming what the Lost Legions had become, what the Chaos Space Marines embraced willingly, falling, and everyone knew it, and no one stopped it because stopping would require admitting what we were. Kelvan spoke less as the decades passed. His counts had stopped entirely. He performed his duties with mechanical precision. He fought with controlled fury. He fed when authorized and did not resist when the authorizations came more frequently. But the light behind his eyes, the thing that had made him Kelvan rather than just another flesh-eater, dimmed gradually, watching it happen, archiving each stage of his deterioration. Nothing done to prevent it, because there was nothing to do. We were both caught in the same machinery. We were both being processed by the system we served. During our 87th year of service together, deployment to a shrine world called Kandor's Light occurred. The world had been overrun by a Khornate warband, renegade space marines from the World Eaters Legion. Our chapter sent 4 companies to retake the world. The fighting was brutal. The World Eaters fought without discipline, driven by rage and the blessings of the Blood God. We fought with controlled precision and our own hunger. The campaign lasted 4 months, pushing the World Eaters back sector by sector, purging them from the shrine cities and the pilgrim routes. The Kornati renegades left atrocities in their wake, civilian populations butchered in blood sacrifices, entire cities reduced to charnel houses. Arrival found the dead stacked in pyramids, their skulls arranged in devotional patterns. On the 107th day of the campaign, a squad of World Eaters was cornered in the ruins of a cathedral. They fought with the fury of the damned. 6 killed, 3 escaped into the catacombs beneath the cathedral. Kelvin and I pursued. The catacombs were ancient, pre-imperial construction. The walls were carved with symbols that predated the cult of the Emperor. Our armor lamps cut through darkness that had existed for millennia, tracking the World Eaters through winding passages, following the blood they trailed and the signature of their corrupted armor on our Auspex scanners, finding them in a burial chamber deep beneath the surface. 3 World Eaters, their armor painted red with brass trim, covered in Kornate iconography. They were feeding. Not on the dead. The catacombs held only ancient bones. They were feeding on each other. One of them was wounded, dying from injuries sustained in the fighting above. The other 2 were consuming him while he still lived, tearing into his flesh with their teeth while he laughed and chanted prayers to Korne. Kelvin and I opened fire. Our bolters roared in the confined space. The first World Eater died instantly, his helmet exploding from a mass reactive round. The second turned to face us and charged, swinging a chain axe that screamed with demon-powered fury. 3 rounds into his chest, he kept coming. Kelvin shot him in the throat. He fell. The third World Eater, the one who had been dying, lay on the floor of the burial chamber, his armor shattered, his organs visible through rents in his power armor. He was still laughing. Blood bubbled from his mouth as he spoke. "You smell like us," he said. His voice was wet, thick. "You smell like hunger, like brothers." Standing above the dying traitor, aiming his bolter at his head. "We are nothing like you." The World Eater laughed harder. "You feed on your own people. You call it loyalty. You dress it up in prayers and justifications. But you feed. Just like us. The only difference is we're honest about what we are." Kelvan pulled the trigger. The World Eater's head exploded. The laughter stopped. But his words did not. They echoed in the burial chamber. They echoed in processing. They echoed because they were true. Standing in the darkness of that ancient catacomb, surrounded by the dead, the World Eaters we had killed, and the bones of people who had died so long ago that history had forgotten them. Kelvin's armor lamp illuminated his profile, his face visible through his helmet's visor, watching him think, process, coming to the same conclusion reached moments before. "He was right," Kelvin said finally. "We are like them. The only difference is they chose damnation consciously. We're choosing it incrementally. Compromises, justifications, but the destination is the same. We are loyal to the Emperor," the words emerged. They felt hollow even as they were spoken. "Are we?" Kelvan turned to face me. "We feed on Imperial citizens. We ignore regulations. We stretch doctrine until it breaks. We serve the chapter's hunger first and the Emperor second. That's not loyalty. That's something else." "Then what would you have us do?" The same question asked on Meridian Secundus decades earlier. "I don't know," Calvin said. "Report the chapter to the Inquisition? Watch them declare us excommunicate traitorous? Watch them send loyalist chapters to purge us? All of us dying because we couldn't control something that was engineered into us from the start?" He was right. The gene seed had done this to us. Sanguinius himself had carried this flaw. The red thirst was not our choice. It was our inheritance. We were victims of biology that had been weaponized 10,000 years ago by the Emperor himself. But we were also perpetrators. Agency existed. Choices were made. Every time feeding occurred on an innocent, every time the chaplain's justifications were accepted, every time silence was maintained when objection should have been raised. Those were choices. Complicity existed. We could leave, the words spoken. The thought had occurred before but never voiced. Become renegades ourselves, at least then we'd be honest about what we are. And feed on whoever we wanted without even the pretense of authorization? No, that's not better, that's just giving up. Then we stay, the conclusion reached. We continue serving. We control the hunger as long as we can. We die when we can't control it anymore. Like Kazron, like Varn. We stay, Kelvin agreed, not because we're loyal, because leaving would make it worse. Exiting the catacombs and returning to the surface, reporting the world eaters eliminated. Commendations received for the successful pursuit, nothing said about the conversation in the burial chamber. Returned to the fortress monastery when the campaign concluded. Service continued. The years continued their accumulation. Others were met who almost mattered. Brother Theron, who served with us for 33 years before being killed by an orc warboss on a world whose name is archived but not accessed. He had been selected from a feudal world where they still fought with swords and shields. He had never fully adapted to the technology of the Imperium, and his perspective was interesting, different. He saw the universe through a framework lost decades earlier. Honor, duty, clear moral lines. He died believing he was righteous. Envy existed for that. Brother Sergeant Orvis commanded our squad for 47 years, after our previous sergeant was killed in action. A veteran of 3 centuries, scarred by countless battles, his armor a patchwork of repairs and replacement parts. He never spoke about the hunger. He simply managed it with grim efficiency. When the time came to feed, he would select targets from whatever population was available and distribute them to the squad with the same clinical detachment used for ammunition allocation. Killed by a chaos sorcerer's warp lightning on a world not remembered. His death was instant. His gene seed was recovered. The chapter continued. Brother Marek served alongside us for 60 years. He had a habit of carving names into his armor, not his own names, but the names of the consumed. Tiny inscriptions along the inside of his vambrace, where no one else would see them. He said it was penance. He said the Emperor would judge him for what he had done, and he wanted to remember every single soul he had taken. His armor eventually ran out of space. Carving names into his own flesh during meditation periods began. The apothecaries discovered this during a routine examination and reported him to the chaplains. Purification rituals were inflicted. He survived, but the light behind his eyes was gone afterward. He became efficient, obedient, empty. Death in combat came 2 years later. Whether he welcomed the end is unknown. They all almost mattered. They all occupied space in awareness for years or decades, but none of them reached the significance Kelvin held. None of them became the anchor that kept something resembling humanity tethered. Kelvin and I served together for 103 years total. The last campaign we fought together was on an ice world designated Mortis 7, a mining colony that had been overrun by tyrannid organisms from a splinter fleet. The fighting was desperate. The Tyranids adapted faster than countermeasures could be developed. 37 battle brothers lost in the first week. The hunger was constant. No civilians to feed on. The Tyranids had consumed them all. No condemned criminals. No suspected traitors. No convenient justifications. Only us and the Xenos and the slowly mounting strain of unsatisfied appetite. On the 23rd day of the campaign, Kelvin's squad was ambushed by Tyranid warriors in a collapsed mining tunnel. The Vox transmission was fragmented, multiple contacts, heavy casualties. Request for immediate reinforcement. My squad deployed to their position, fighting through a swarm of termagants and homagants to reach the tunnel, finding Kelvin's squad decimated. 6 battle brothers dead, 3 wounded critically. Kelvin was still fighting, his armor shattered across his left side, his arm hanging useless, his bolter empty. Using his combat knife, stabbing it repeatedly into the skull of a Tyranid warrior that had him pinned against the tunnel wall. The remaining Xenos were killed, the area secured. Going to Kelvin, he was still standing but barely. The Tyranid warrior had wounded him severely. His armor's medical systems were struggling to keep him alive. His primary heart was visible through the rent in his chest plate. It was beating irregularly. The secondary heart had been punctured. "Vastic," he said. His voice was weak, distorted through his damaged Vox system. "Good. Need to tell you something. Save your strength," the words offered. "The apothecaries are en route." "No." He shook his head slightly. The motion seemed to cause him pain. "Listen, I've been counting again. Not time, not pain. Something else." Enough death had been observed to recognize the signs. The apothecaries would arrive too late. His gene seed would be recovered, but Kelvin himself was already gone. Witnessing the final moments. "I've been counting souls," Kelvin continued. His eyes were unfocused, looking past me at something unseen. "All the people we fed on, all the consumed, trying to remember all of them, trying to add them up, give them recognition, because no one else will. No one else counts." Blood leaked from his mouth. His armor's medical systems were failing. His vitals were declining on helmet display, each measurement registered, heart rate decreasing, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation critical. "I got to 4,738, Kelvin said. "That's how many I personally consumed. 4,738 Imperial citizens. Some guilty, most not. All their names known, all their memories processed, all of them carried." His breathing was labored now, wet, rattling. The sound biological systems make when catastrophic shutdown begins. I thought if I counted them, if I remembered them, it would mean something, that it would be penance. But it doesn't mean anything. They're still dead. I'm still what I am. The counting doesn't change that. Kneeling beside him, placing hand on his shoulder, carefully avoiding the damaged areas. No words existed in any language known that could address what he was expressing. "You were right," finally said. "On Meridian Secundus, on Candor's light, in every conversation we had. You were right about all of it. We are what you said we are." Kelvin smiled. It was a terrible expression, blood-stained and sorrowful. "Doesn't help, does it? Being right doesn't fix anything." It doesn't. His vitals continued declining, watching the measurements decrease in real time. Heart rate 43, 37, 28. His second heart had stopped entirely. The primary heart was failing. His brain was being deprived of oxygen. Consciousness would fade in seconds. Death would follow in less than a minute. "One more for you to count," Kelvin whispered. His voice was barely audible. 4,739. Count yourself. You're being consumed too, by the hunger, by the chapter, by what we are. Count yourself among the dead, Vastic. It's more honest. His eyes closed. His heart stopped. The vitals on display flatlined. Brother Kelvan, Aspirant 449, who had counted his way through the transformation and stopped counting when he realized the process was infinite, who had served for 103 years and consumed 4,738 souls, who had been the only person in the Imperium who understood exactly what I was. He was gone. The apothecaries arrived 7 minutes later. Gene seed recovery, body processing for any salvageable equipment. Death logged in the chapter records as a casualty of Xeno's combat. Moving on to the next wounded battle brother, standing in that collapsed mining tunnel and registering the moment, archiving every detail. The temperature, -47 degrees Celsius. The smell, blood, ozone, Xeno's excretion, the mineral scent of ice and rock. The sound, personal breathing inside helmet, distant rumble of artillery, drip of melting ice somewhere in the darkness. Attempting to feel grief. Attempting to access the emotional protocols that baseline humans experience when they lose someone significant. Searching processes for the appropriate response. Nothing found. Just data. Just archived information about a battle brother who had served alongside and was now terminated. The hunger was still there. Constant, unsatisfied. Even Kelvin's death did not touch it. Even the loss of the only person who mattered did not diminish the appetite. Realization came in that moment that Kelvin had been correct, already dead. The person who had been Jeren Vastik, who had held a warm cup in cold hands in an underhive hab block, who had had a sister named Mara, and a mother who sorted salvage, that person was gone. Consumed. Processed. What remained was the hunger wearing his armor. The hunger counting down the time until control failed entirely, and joining Kazran and Van and all the others who had fallen before. This realization was archived and return to combat occurred. The campaign on Mortis 7 lasted another 37 days. The Tyrannid presence was eliminated. 83 battle brothers lost total. The chapter logged it as an acceptable casualty ratio. Return to the fortress monastery. New orders received. The cycle continued. After Kelvin's death, solitary assignments were requested when available. Volunteering for solo reconnaissance missions, for long-duration watch posts, for any duty that would minimize contact with the chapter. The requests were granted. Service had exceeded a century by then. A degree of autonomy had been earned. 14 months spent alone in a listening post on the edge of a dead system, monitoring Vox channels for signs of enemy activity. The post was a small facility carved into an asteroid, automated systems maintaining life support while sensors were monitored. Alone, except for the machines. No other battle brothers, no serfs, no one to feed on, no one to speak to. The hunger was constant. The supply servitor delivered nutrient paste on a weekly schedule. Consuming it, it satisfied nothing. The hunger remained, gnawing, insistent, a background process that never terminated. Time was spent reviewing archived data, accessing every memory consumed through the Amophagia, 4,976 souls by count, processing them systematically, reviewing their lives, their memories, their final moments, trying to understand what they had been, what had been taken from them, what their deaths had purchased. A woman who had worked in a textile factory. She had had a daughter who painted pictures of flowers that did not exist on their hive world. The woman used to buy colored pencils on the black market, contraband luxuries that cost a week's wages, so her daughter could continue drawing. Consumption occurred on Meridian Secundus. She was never charged with a crime. She was simply available when the hunger demanded satisfaction. A man who had served in the Astra Militarum for 20 years, surviving campaigns against orcs, against chaos cultists, against Tau expansion fleets, decorated for valor, training recruits, passing on lessons learned through decades of combat. His regiment was declared compromised after exposure to a Nurgle plague that had corrupted 17% of their numbers. The remaining 83% were culled as a precautionary measure. Consumption occurred along with 42 others from his regiment. He did not resist. He thanked for making his death quick. A child. Designation unregistered. Age, approximately 8 standard years. Crime, parentage. His father had been convicted of heresy. The entire bloodline was condemned. Consumption occurred on a shrine world during the purge operation. He asked if the Emperor would forgive him. Told that the Emperor forgives the faithful. It was a lie. The Emperor does not forgive. The Emperor requires. And what he required was that child's death to satisfy hunger, reviewing them all. Every soul, every memory, every moment of terror and resignation and desperate hope processed through the Amophagia, cataloging them with the precision Kelvin had attempted, counting them, acknowledging them. It changed nothing. They were still dead, still what I was. The counting was simply another ritual, another coping mechanism, another way to pretend that acknowledgement equaled atonement. In the 14th month of isolation, something not felt since transformation began was experienced. Silence. Not auditory silence. The listening post hummed with machinery. with the subtle vibrations of the asteroid, with the distant radiation of nearby stars translated into electromagnetic static. But internal silence, the hunger quieted for approximately 7 hours, existing without the constant gnawing need. Without the appetite driving processes, without the shadow of Sanguinius's curse demanding satisfaction. The reason is unknown. Perhaps it was starvation, the body finally accepting that no feeding was available and shutting down the craving to conserve energy. Perhaps it was psychological, some final breaking point where the mind stops demanding what it cannot have. Perhaps it was nothing. A temporary glitch in the implanted organs, a fluctuation in brain chemistry, meaningless biological noise. But for 7 hours, internal silence existed. Existing without hunger, processing thoughts without the constant background drive toward consumption, remembering what it had been like before the transformation, before the homophagia, before the red thirst became the dominant force in existence. Remembering being cold in an underhive hab block, remembering sister coughing, remembering mother's face. Then the hunger returned. It came back stronger than before, as if the temporary absence had intensified its presence. 3 weeks' worth of nutrient paste consumed in a single sitting. It satisfied nothing. The hunger remained. The silence was gone. 67 years of service occurred after Kelvin's death, fighting in campaigns barely remembered, killing enemies whose faces blur together in archives, feeding when the chapter authorized feeding, staying silent when objection should have been raised, remaining loyal to the institution that was slowly becoming what it claimed to fight against, watching the chapter continue its descent. The feeding protocols expanded further. The chaplains stopped providing justifications. They simply designated targets and expected compliance. The chapter master authorized raids on Imperial worlds when local criminal populations were insufficient, taking people from their homes, taking people who had committed no crimes, taking people because they were required. Other chapters began to notice. The Ultramarines refused to fight alongside us after an incident on a war world where feeding occurred on wounded Imperial Guard soldiers. The Salamanders filed a formal complaint with the Administratum after witnessing our feeding practices on a civilian population. The Inquisition opened 3 separate investigations into our chapter's activities. Survival of the investigations occurred. Allies existed in the right positions. Centuries of loyal service on record existed. Threats to the Imperium had been eliminated that other chapters had failed to address. The investigations were closed with recommendations for doctrinal review and enhanced oversight. Nothing changed. Continuation occurred as before. Age, 215 years old now. Service to the Flesh Eaters, chapter, 204 years. Fighting on 307 worlds. Killing in numbers that exceed calculation ability. 4,976 souls consumed that were counted, and likely hundreds more not tracked carefully in the early years. Existing now in a state of functional deterioration. The red thirst has become permanent. The hunger is constant. The intervals between feeding have decreased to the point where weekly consumption is required to maintain operational effectiveness. The apothecaries have conducted examinations. Information given that the threshold where control will fail is approaching, where becoming what Kazran became will occur, what Van became, what all flesh eaters eventually become. 2 options have been offered. Accepting induced termination, a peaceful death, gene seed recovered, name added to the chapter's honored dead, or continuing to serve until control is lost, at which point execution will occur and name struck from the records. Decision not made. The decision feels irrelevant. Both options end the same way. Both require ceasing to exist. The only difference is timing and whether name remains in the archives. Thinking about reporting the chapter. Contact with the Inquisition could occur. Detailed testimony could be provided about the feeding practices, the unauthorized raids, the systematic violation of Imperial doctrine. Triggering an investigation that might actually result in the chapter's dissolution or purging could happen. This is not done. Not because loyalty to the chapter exists, not because belief in righteousness remains, but because reporting them would not undo what has been done. The 4,976 souls consumed would not return to life. The atrocities would not be erased. And the Inquisition's purge would simply add more bodies to the count. Every battle brother in the chapter killed for the crime of being what the Emperor's gene seed made them. Complicity exists, has always existed. Every time feeding occurred without authorization. Every time justifications known to be lies were accepted. Every time silence was maintained when objection should have been raised. This was chosen, not the hunger that was inherited, but the response to the hunger, the willingness to satisfy it at the cost of innocent lives. That was choice, that was agency, that was me. The Imperium is a machine that consumes. It processes humans into soldiers, into servitors, into fuel for the endless war. It takes children from their homes and transforms them into weapons. It demands faith and provides nothing but suffering. It spans 1,000,000 worlds, and every single one of them is a factory for producing death. We are a small component in that machine, the Flesh Eaters chapter, consuming imperial citizens and producing military victories, feeding the hunger and calling it loyalty. Being what the Imperium made us, and perpetuating the system that made us, because knowing how to do anything else does not exist. Becoming the listening post has occurred. Existing in isolation, monitoring signals, processing data, waiting for orders that will deploy one final time. The hunger is constant. The memories are archived. The count is maintained. 4,976 souls, plus one more. Myself. Kelvin was right. Counting myself among the consumed should occur, being eaten by what I am, by what has been done, by the hunger that will never be satisfied, no matter how much feeding occurs. Brother Vastic of the Flesh Eaters, Chapter, 3rd Company, 8th Tactical Squad, selected from an Underhive Hab block 204 years ago. A mother who sorted salvage, a sister who coughed blood. A warm cup held in hands and cold air felt on face. These things are remembered with the clarity of archived data, protected and preserved because they are the only evidence that humanity ever existed.
No longer human. Hunger, wearing armor. Appetite bound by oaths already broken, loyal to a chapter that has become renegade, serving an Imperium that consumes everything it touches. A weapon that has become aware of what it is used for, and continues functioning anyway because ceasing to function would require courage not possessed. The temperature in quarters is 21 degrees Celsius. Controlled, optimal, nothing like the cold remembered. The recaf dispenser produces liquid that tastes exactly as the Underhive substitute did, like licking rust. Consuming it anyway, not for warmth, not for comfort, simply because the ritual persists, waiting for the hunger to consume entirely, waiting for control to fail, waiting for the moment when becoming the thing approached for 2 centuries will occur, the waiting for the end that is deserved and not desired. The Emperor does not protect, the Emperor requires, and everything has been given to him. Humanity, morality, soul. 4,976 other souls have been given, taken without permission, consumed without justice, justified through lies, told because the alternative was admitting what I am. This is testimony. This is the data archived. This is what remains when everything else is processed out. The hunger, the count, the cold memory of a warm cup in a child's hands. The machine continues. The cycle persists. The Imperium consumes, and Brother Vastic continues existing as part of that consumption, loyal to nothing but the hunger, waiting for the end that will not be sought but cannot be escaped. The count stands at 4,977. Addition to the number has occurred.